You're about to watch two programmes from the BBC's world-famous Natural History Unit, Bird Brain of Britain and The Flying Gourmet's Guide, just one of the wildlife specials priced at £9.99 each. BBC Wildlife Specials also contain some touching true life stories, including Squirrel on My Shoulder.
I tried giving the young squirrel a start in the right direction, staying close at hand, ready to jump to the rescue if the cat decided to turn on the uninvited guest.
On the same cassette, the highly acclaimed Brockside, a true-life soap opera starring families of badgers that live in and around towns and have adapted to an urban way of life. Also in the series of wildlife specials, On the Tracks of the Wild Otter, a film about the lives of these very rare and beautiful animals in their home on the Shetland Islands, captured for BBC Video by top cameraman Hugh Miles. And on the same £9.99 video, The Mouse's Tale, the story of the little rodents that share our homes and our lives. Aliens from inner space, animals that could come from another world, but quietly inhabit our own in the depths of the oceans, now captured on BBC Video in all their strange and colourful beauty. And on the same cassette, just when you thought it was safe to go back into the water, the fastest claw in the West tells the story of the killer shrimps.
Many strange creatures haunt the depths of the sea, but few have such an unexpected talent as the mantis shrimp.
Southampton, 1921. A new type of raid takes place. Method of entry, break-in through milk bottle top. Object, theft of cream inside. Culprit, a blue tit. Once learnt, this new technique proves popular and is swiftly copied by other criminals. Nowadays, the crime wave has spread all over the country.
A lot of you have probably had this happen to your milk, and even though you may have been a little bit annoyed that they'd stolen the cream, you were probably impressed that a bird was clever enough to learn such a trick. Well, that's precisely what this programme is all about. It's a nationwide search to find the clever birds in the country, and if you reckon breaking into a bottle is smart, just have a look at this.
How do you get at a wagon load of peanuts that weighs 3 or 4 times more than you do? In the 50s, an amateur naturalist called H.G. Hurrell, together with Maurice Brooks King, posed this problem for the birds visiting his garden. Only one blue tit, dubbed Shorty because he'd lost his tail, ever worked it out. 30 years later, The winter before last, in fact, another of Hurrell's designs was retested in more than 20 gardens around the south of England. A peanut is hidden in the drawer of the matchbox. Tap down the drawer from the top and the nut drops out. My role in the search was to film the birds as they tackled the problems. After a few weeks, this blue tit was beginning to solve the matchbox test, and before long both blue and great tits were cracking it regularly. When that matchbox test was shown on television last year, it fascinated a lot of people, just as it had fascinated Hurrell and Brooks King. In fact, it started a nationwide search for the bird brain of Britain. One new test gave us an insight into how the birds were learning to solve these problems. A toothbrush holder with 4 matchsticks. Pull out the matches and the nut drops out. This blue tit still hasn't worked out that pulling matches and the nut dropping are related. He's encouraged by the sight of his reward and eventually, perhaps through frustration rather than reason, pulls out a matchstick. An aggressive great tit seems to have worked out the method. But apparently he's still unsure of the order. After about 1 week, the blue tit seems to catch on, even if he is a little bit hesitant. Success at last. Well, nearly. The test is reset, and the great tit demonstrates what can eventually be learnt by trial and error. The next test I filmed couldn't be learnt in stages. It consisted of peanuts on strings suspended between sheets of perspex. The only way to get at the nuts is to pull up the strings. Many birds were attracted by the sight of the nuts, but they were at a loss as to how to get to them. Finally, one male great tit appeared and did the test straight off. This one seemed to be a natural when it came to string pulling, and so a plan was hatched to see just how long a string this bird could handle. 30 centimetres, and he has no problem at all. Apart from the crows and a few finches, the tits are the only British birds that have been seen string pulling in the wild. In slow motion, you can really appreciate the delicate coordination of beak and footwork it requires. Just when I was beginning to think that tits were the only potential bird brain winners, I heard that a chaffinch was attempting this extraordinary homemade nail test. But this hen bird hadn't learned that you had to pull out the nails in the right order to get a reward. Finches were often seen hanging around the tests, probably hoping to pick up scraps, but it was always the tits that worked out the technique. The chaffinch did eventually learn to take advantage of work done by others. Another test-cracking species was reported from Bath, but this one wasn't the intended student. By March of the first year, however, it was clear that the tits were emerging nationwide as the champions. Within weeks, they seemed able to crack any single stage problem they were faced with. To stretch them further, a two-stage test was developed. This time, the contestants not only have to pull out the matches, but also tap down the matchbox tray. The blue tit was obviously an old hand at the matches, but was stumped by the matchbox. With most of the work done for him, a nearby great tit finishes the job, leaving one rather annoyed blue tit. This unusual relationship went on for at least a week. The great tit knew the box test, the blue tit knew the toothbrush holder. This time, the blue tit gets its reward. In a roundabout sort of fashion. To me, it appeared almost as though one bird was struggling to understand what the other was doing. He throws a match in pure frustration. Finally, and without the help of its unlikely ally, the great tit succeeds. By the end of the first year, it was beginning to look as though the tits were the only birds that were going to try the puzzles. In fact, very few other birds even visited the tests. Now this brings up the question, is it because the tits are more intelligent? Well, it's difficult to say, but it's probably just that the birds, the tits that is, feeding habits, are best suited to the matchbox type of puzzle. In fact, if you watch a woodland like this, you can see the very same feeding behaviour on the beech mast as they use on the matchbox puzzle. Great tits and blue tits are used to searching for food hidden in crevices or leaf litter. They have an inquisitive, searching nature that encourages them to attempt the tests in the first place. Ripping open milk bottle tops may just be a natural extension of the ripping behaviour they use every day to break into the food they find. So the tits clearly had an unfair advantage from day one. So what we needed then was to devise a test that didn't require the agility that the tits had, which might then attract some more species of birds. Different designs were tried throughout the country. In Scotland, a large version of the toothbrush holder was built for members of the crow family. Meat replaced peanuts, and there were bigger pegs for bigger beaks. Even though it was an excellent area for rooks, they were rarely seen around the test, and then only when there was food that could be quickly grabbed. The crows, which come in for a hard time from man, were just too wary, or maybe too bright, to drop their guard. On the Cumbrian coast, at Walney, an electric test was tried out on herring gulls. It consisted of plastic cups that were filled up with dog meat. If the gulls pressed the button, the cups would revolve and reveal some meat. The first gulls were attracted by scraps left on top. The researchers hoped gulls would learn to press the button by mistake, which they duly did. Before long, the device was in regular use, but the gulls never managed to solve a more complex problem than button pushing. Pigeons were tested with another electric device. Peck the red button and grain is delivered from a clearly visible store. Within 2 weeks, a couple of pigeons had solved the problem. But this relatively simple task was just the first stage. The plan was to gradually make the electric box more difficult and compare how the pigeons fared against the tits.
Meanwhile, the search for the bird brain of Britain was going on, and some interesting things are beginning to emerge.
In Maidstone, Catherine Jones was determined to discover whether the birds coming to her garden could recognise and remember colours. She designed a colour-coded feeder. The nuts were hidden behind the white front, but the birds could only get food by pulling the red matches. The first arrivals pulled randomly at both colours until eventually they got a nut. But after 2 months, this blue tit knew what he was doing. Just watch how persistently he pulls at the red matches, totally ignoring the blue ones. Determination pays off in the end. Meanwhile, in a Sussex garden, Andrew and Stuart Hyland designed yet another colour test out of Lego. The nut is delivered by the blue lever. By changing the position of the blue tab, they were able to conclusively test that the birds responded to the colour and not just the position of the tab. And once more.
Well, we've seen the blue tits doing the colour test, but what about shapes? Well, here in Kent, Jeff Bennett had a great spotted woodpecker visiting his garden. So he decided to test the birds by putting out these different shaped plaques on his lawn and loading just the star-shaped ones with cob nuts, like this.
At first, this male woodpecker checked all the shapes for food. But after about 6 weeks, he learned to ignore the other shapes and only visited the stars.
By the time that woodpecker had sorted out the problem with the shapes, the pigeons here on the roofs of Bristol were beginning to get to grips with a more complex version of the electric box test.
Of the 2 discs, only one ever delivers grain. At the moment, green is sensitive. The box is switched to red by remote control, and at first this bright pigeon persists with green, but eventually tries red. It's switched back, and the pigeon also reverts to green. Only 2 pigeons ever learnt to change over like this. Psychologists call this the ability to reverse, and it's often used as a simple test of animal intelligence. We wondered how the tits would manage a similar choice. They had learnt to jump on either the red or the green bar. At the moment, red gives a reward. When the changeover is made, however, the first arrival is understandably confused. And eventually gives up without trying the green bar. In fact, the tits never learnt to make rapid reversals, and it was usually a good 20 minutes before they were back on the correct colour. At the start of 1985, we got our first heavy snowfalls. Natural food supplies became scarce. Hunger sharpened appetite and increased activity at bird tables. And I started to hear of new puzzles being solved all round the country. In Somerset, Dennis Edwards was so determined to discover which individual birds visiting his garden were the smartest that he put coloured rings on their legs and challenged them with this block pull test. To solve the test, the birds have to pull the string, which is connected to the block, that then delivers the nut through the hole in the front of the tube. This bird without a ring clearly hasn't got a clue. The bird with the pink ring again does it perfectly. Dennis Edwards then decided to challenge them with the most complex test for tits so far. It's a multi-block test. This time, the birds not only have to pull the string, but the clever bird has to look at the position of the nut before he does so. It's only that way that he'll pull the blocks in the right order. The bird without a ring again, getting it wrong. When he comes back, though, he takes the time to look at the position of the nut. And gets it right, with great efficiency. The joy of colour-ringing the garden regulars was that their individual characters began to emerge. This blue tit with a white ring on its leg was a very nervous bird, but also very bright. The bird with a red ring on its leg often turned up and was more dominant, but didn't seem to be quite as clever. He pulls at the blocks without looking at the position of the nut. Finally, he does it in the right order. The cold weather also encouraged pigeons to solve this high-tech task. They have to peck the 4 buttons in the right order: red, orange, green, then white. And the robot arm will fetch them some grain. This dark little bird learned to press the red button first, and the arm duly scooped up some grain. But there, things ground to a halt. It wasn't until March, when the snow had gone, that this same pigeon finally cottoned on. First, it presses the red button correctly. The interesting thing about this test is the bird now has to wait. It can't press the next button until the arm has stopped moving. Notice how the bird seems to be watching the position of the arm until it stops. There goes the orange tab. Arm stops. Now the green. And the white. Just when I thought that the pigeons had really proved themselves undeniably smarter than the tits, we heard from Sussex that even though there was food freely available on the bird table, some blue tits were starting to solve a Lego test that involved not only 3 stages, but also required 3 totally different techniques. They have to spin the arm, take out the match and then tip the seesaw to get the nut. There goes the nut, down to the second chamber. The first birds to see the test had trouble at this second stage. The test is reset, and a bird completes it, although not in the correct order. He takes out the match first, spins the arms, tips the seesaw, and pays for his mistake by losing the nut to a great tit. And this time in the correct order. Spin the arm, take out the match, and get your nut. One more time. 3 stages in the correct order. Back with the pigeons on the roofs of Bristol, one bird surprised us with a new level of intelligence. The electric box now had a light. White meant peck red, yellow meant peck green. Even the most complex multi-stage test might eventually be solved by trial and error, but this was different. The pigeon here had to think out the relationship between the lights and the buttons to get the grain. Had this pigeon beaten the tits to the title of Bird Brain of Britain? I took academic advice. The Oxford University zoologist, Dr. John Krebs, has been setting his own intelligence tests for tits. How did he rate their performance?
Well, I think all the tests we've seen so far in the search for the Bird Brain of Britain look very impressive, but when you think about what the birds are actually doing, it's rather like this simple children's game. The tits have the dexterity to fit the shapes into the holes, like this, and they're able to discriminate between different shapes so they can put the right shape in the right hole. That's all very well, but it's quite a different matter to play a game like chess. To play a game like chess, you need not only the dexterity to move the pieces around on the board, but you also have to be able to think, to plan ahead.
Krebs believes that recent studies have shown many birds plan ahead just for day-to-day survival. In one study, special bird tables for wild starlings were set up, near to the nest box. And also in a field much further away. In the spring, when starlings are working hard to keep their chicks fed, they have to make a decision where they're going to collect food before they leave the nest box. When they go a short distance, to the nearby bird table, the researchers found they would only take a couple of mealworms before returning to their hungry chicks. When starlings make the longer flights over the fields to the distant feeding station, just as we might decide to drive out to the hypermarket, they make sure they get a good beakful. Similarly, we make sure we get a good trolley load for the extra effort involved. The worms get fewer and harder to find, and more of the bird's time goes in loading up and checking out. So like us, the starlings have to decide whether to make a few long-distance trips for a lot of food or more short trips for less. But for the bird, calculating where to go and how many worms to bring back is vital. If they're wrong, chicks may starve to death.
The remarkable thing is that the birds seem to get it more or less right every flight. They bring back the maximum amount of food for healthy growth of their chicks. Now, this must involve complex decisions, although we don't really know how they do it.
Perhaps then, our garden birds may be a lot more intelligent than we originally thought they were. I certainly got that impression when I filmed the Bird Brain of Britain doing this quite remarkable multi-stage test.
Believe it or not, 8 stages had to be solved, and all in the right order. When I was called in to film the performance, it had taken this same white-ringed bird over a year of gradual learning to crack this ultimate test. First, take out the matchsticks. Then, tip the seesaw. Pull the nails in the correct order. And then a block pull test. Let's hear it for the Bird Brain of Britain.
Flying Gourmet's Guide's most exclusive restaurant. In the gardens of Buckingham Palace, a bird table by royal appointment to Her Majesty. Open only to a few select guests, this restaurant is set in landscaped English parkland with palatial vistas. Dining beneath the colonnades and constantly serenaded by the resident band, guests can be assured the strictest security arrangements. That's how the Flying Gourmet's Guide describes the royal bird table here at Buckingham Palace. Now, that bird table is just the other side of the wall in the 46 acres of the palatial gardens. It's one of over 100 bird tables that I looked at to compile this guide for hungry birds. It's a kind of a consumer's guide, the what, when and where to feed in the best of your back garden restaurants. I've always known there's more to bird tables than our national obsession because, in fact, they're essential to the survival of our urban wildlife. If you didn't feed your back garden birds, over 50% of them could die. So if you think bird tables are just a couple of bits of old wood and some peanuts, take a look at these. I checked out in the search for the best bird table in Britain. It's taken me on a nationwide survey which has led from Buckingham Palace to this one here on the Forties Delta oil platform over 100 miles out in the North Sea. This is what bird tables are really about, bringing wildlife closer to you. At its simplest, a bird table can just be your hand. Birds like that robin are actually very specific about the things they eat. So no matter how complex your bird table, what really matters is the food on offer. So the first thing I checked out for the Gourmet's Guide was the menu. Eight in the morning, Britain's top bird table chef, Michael Eyre, at work.
Once I've mixed the ingredients, I pour them into a bowl, and then I add the special ingredient which attracts the birds to the bird table. It's a real speciality of mine, this.
Michael Eyre makes egg custard every morning for one very special client. Normally a shyish waterbird, which is an unlikely visitor to any bird table, moorhens eating egg custard is a bizarre sight. But Michael's convinced it's the only thing they come for.
Well, I reckon that the moorhens only come to the bird table because they're attracted by the egg custard and the nutmeg.
Egg custard, of course, is only on the menu at a few restaurants, catering for the minority taste. These, on the other hand, were on offer on virtually every bird table menu. Now, for the Gourmet's Guide, I surveyed the foods most frequently provided in our back garden restaurants and found that peanuts were well up in the top 5. 7,000 tonnes of peanuts are prepared each year purely to cater for back garden birds. With 5.78 calories per gram, peanuts are a protein-packed, high-energy food. The trouble is, though, people stick them in bags, which makes them difficult to get at. That makes for slow service, and for birds eating to live, the difference between life and death. For the Gourmet's Guide, I commissioned a special consumer's test to compare plastic nut bags with the standard metal nut feeder to see which provides the fastest food. Starting at dawn, a busy garden of tits went to lunch on 100 grams of nuts. By the time it got dark, only 30 grams had gone. Next day, the same garden, another 100 grams of nuts. But how's this for the ultimate fast food joint? Tits are not the only birds to exploit this high-energy food source. In winter, some greenfinches exist almost entirely on peanuts, nothing else. While the recent explosive spread of siskins across the country can be partly explained by their learning the peanut habit. In the leafy gardens of the southeast, peanuts provide an important food source for the escapee and now resident ring-necked parakeet. 45% of all the sightings of these invaders are from garden feeders. But surely these must be the most attractive peanut gourmets. I photographed these squirrels here at the first of 5 restaurants which I'm going to especially recommend in the Flying Gourmet's Guide. At the foot of the Cairngorms, I particularly chose this feeding station for providing the very best in Scottish fare. Haggis is always on the menu at my first recommended restaurant. 3-star rated for a warm Scottish welcome and top-class service, Mrs. Gwen Rankin's table is a real extravaganza. Daily helpings include over 20 haggis, innumerable nut feeders, and local dish of the day, the Cairngorm sausage. But it's fat that's favourite with Mrs. Rankin's other star clients, crested tits. Found only in the Speyside area of Scotland, these birds are not shy to take advantage of man. Just like red squirrels, it's only their restricted range that makes them very rare bird table visitors. At 7.49 calories per gram, fat is the most high-energy food provided by any back garden restaurateurs. When pushed into holes, it can attract unusual visitors like this tree creeper that normally only eats insects. A national survey has shown that fat is top-notch with greater spotted woodpeckers. Coconut comes third on the energy scale, but beware. It is very important never to provide desiccated coconut because it swells up in the birds' stomachs. Cut a natural coconut in half to attract the more agile feeder. Bread has the lowest energy value, but it is the most commonly served meal. Down in Devon, Mrs. Wanda Stadden found she had some guests with a very particular taste in bread. At 10 o'clock every morning, she's summoned to the window. Wild swans from the ex-estuary make their daily demand for hot cross buns. Anything but hot cross buns is sent straight back to the kitchen. And why not wash it down with a carafe of house water? Moisture is actually very important. Dry, stale bread can cause birds to choke, particularly the chicks. Always provide water, and it is probably safer not to feed in the spring when birds are breeding. Bread is also on the menu at the second of my recommended restaurants, where Hilary Laws attracts grey squirrels to her own breakfast table. Situated on the edge of Dartmoor, this restaurant attracts 52 different species from the surrounding woodland. It has a 4-star rating for its imaginative menu novelties.
Well, I tried hemp and I find it very popular. The birds, they're lining up for it. It's like Piccadilly Circus.
Being on the edge of woodland, marsh tits occur at this table. And coal tits absolutely pile in. Occasionally, Hilary's favourite, the nuthatch. Menu novelty number 2, meat scraps from the butcher. These bring in jays, blackbirds, even the ever-shy crow, but the real celebrity guest is this buzzard. There are only a handful of records for buzzards occurring in gardens. Though they are natural scavengers, a tradition of persecution has made buzzards very shy of man. Hello.
Yes, please.
Could I have a portion of cod and chips, please?
Okay, just be a minute with the card.
All right, thanks, yeah. Surviving the winter can be really hard for birds. Long-tailed tits, for instance, may have to spend up to 97% of their waking hours just looking for food. So what they need is a readily available, high-energy meal. Now, if we look at our top 5 menu, for calories per gram, we can see that fat comes out best for energy, followed by peanuts at 5.78 calories per gram, and then coconut and grain, which are about the same. Lastly, there's bread, and that only has a third of the calories which fat has. The best restaurants in the guide served all of our top 5 foods, but we only found one which served these. For over 10 years, Roger Norman's been putting out chip shop chuck-outs, which are firm favourites with his favourite bird, the starling. He's been ringing them as part of a long-term project, and nothing brings starlings down quicker than fish and chips. The odd black-headed gull is also partial to a greasy chip or two. Apart from the all-important menu, what else is it that actually makes you choose a restaurant? Well, I reckon another important factor is the atmosphere, the very design of the restaurant, and that's what we're going to look at next in our guide. Despite the terrifying atmosphere that clouds this table, it attracts a surprising number of birds. It's the brainchild of Britain's leading bird table designer, Jim Chedburn.
This particular table is based on the Gothic design, really. Idea here really being to try and attract the more discerning bird. One of the problems in designing tables is water collecting on a table, especially if you're using wood. So this one has a number of gargoyles, ceramic gargoyles, which are designed to take the water off the roofs and off the slopes on the table and actually direct them off the table itself. Then we've got some stained glass on the table, very bright colours. That's really intended to attract the birds to it in the winter. But the main feature of this particular table are the dragons. One of the problems I've had in the past is squirrels coming onto the table and bashing it to bits. So this one has a large dragon at the bottom, a sort of ferocious-looking dragon. And the idea being that the squirrels see this dragon and get scared off.
The scope of architectural designs I found on British bird tables was staggering. This is a medieval castle with its own ramparts and turrets, while this half-timbered Tudor restaurant has a rather special interior dining room. This curious table moderne offers meals at not 1, not 2, but at 3 levels, a high-rise restaurant. Cats mean danger, but this suspended platform evades the problem. The frustrated cat can only watch as the birds party to their beats' content. A clever pulley system allows Christina Roberts to refill the table. The ultimate feline deterrent must be the floating restaurant. But then how do you keep it stocked up? Well, Mrs. Bentley Taylor overcame this teething design fault by dropping food down a gutter pipe to the table floating 3 metres below. The prize for this design was one of the rarest visitors reported at any of our bird tables. Shy, skulking, normally found only deep in reed beds, water rails usually only come to bird tables in very harsh weather. During the severe winter of 62-63, they were actually recorded killing other visitors to tables for food. Brilliant. Keeping squirrels at bay stumped practically all bird table designers. This is really the only feeding station which has succeeded. Basically, it's a globe of chicken wire that surrounds the nut feeders. Fat is also provided at the base. This nut burglar and all his gang of 10 accomplices failed to penetrate the wire and always left empty-handed. The small birds, though, could easily squeeze through the wire to reach the food, so this restaurant soon became popular with all sorts of visitors. Including this jay, hovering hummingbird-like to get the fat. But with a false sense of security inspired by the wire, the tits didn't realise someone else was coming to dinner. A sparrowhawk. In slow motion, you can appreciate the extraordinary manoeuvres as the hawk pursues its meal on wings. The blue tit makes a break. Got him. Let's see that again. This time watch the blue tit. The tit squeezes out, and in a spectacular backflip, the hawk snatches it upside down. Apart from the menu and the design, it's the quality of service that makes you choose a restaurant, and birds are no different, and that's what we're going to look at next. When it comes to personal service, nothing beats this. Dennis Barnett hand feeds this young greater spotted woodpecker with bits of digestive biscuits. Britain comes top of the international league in bird table service, with over half of British households feeding the birds. Even when it gets dark, the service doesn't stop at some bird tables. And during my travels, I've come across quite a few all-night restaurants. The services at Richard Rowe's Falmouth table are a regular stop-off on this badger's nightly round. Long claws help scrape up every last peanut. Night and day, all over the country, I've found that people are putting a remarkable effort into just feeding their birds. In fact, in 10 million gardens, people are spending about £15 million a year just to do this. But what interested me from the ecological point of view was, is it all worthwhile? Do the birds really need our food? And what would happen if we didn't feed them at all? You have to get into the air to appreciate from a bird's eye view the problem of surviving and finding food in town. In an urban area like this, the average blue tit probably flies about 500 metres to find food, which means that it covers an area of about 20 gardens like these. But exactly how many individuals does any one of these 20 gardens cater for? Looking at a particularly busy bistro table, this proprietor probably imagines he has a maximum clientele of 9 or 10 blue tits. But colour ringing can reveal a surprise. Orange and blue. Green, white, red. Red and blue. Double black. In fact, the national record count on a single garden is 148 individual blue tits, and most gardens have well over 50. Given that you're catering for more birds than you might think, how dependent are they on your particular feeding station? Researchers at Cardiff University tried to work this out by timing how long any individual bird spend on a feeder. The watch starts. This time it's double orange. Most blue tits spend between 1 or 2 minutes on each feed. Double orange leaves and the watch is stopped. 52 seconds. Using a graph projected from past observations, the researcher is able to predict when the tit should return. About 28 minutes. Start the watch, see how long it takes to return, and if the prediction is true, the bird must be getting all of its food from just that one feeder and nowhere else. Double orange is back. 28 minutes and 20 seconds, an accurate prediction. The Cardiff researchers found that in rural areas with isolated restaurants, about half the birds coming to a garden were totally dependent on the feeders. This effectively means that if these 2 feeders were taken down, 50% of the birds would probably die. Right, enough of all the facts and figures. I know you're all on the edge of your perches waiting to see the best bird table in Britain. But first, I'm going to show you the worst. Because here on the Isle of Skye, there's a proprietor who, despite tremendous effort, attracts virtually no diners to his table. On the very northwest tip of the island, James Milne's bird table must be Britain's most remote gastronomic outpost. Despite this, for nearly a quarter of a century, he has struggled against all odds to provide quality local produce. Kippers daily, garnished with oatcakes.
When we moved to Glendale 22 years ago, there wasn't a single bird in sight, not even a sparrow. But with determined efforts, we managed to build up so that now we may even see 1 blue tit, 1 robin, 1 or 2 dunnocks, sometimes, very occasionally, 1 thrush, and on one very special occasion this last winter, 1 goldfinch.
The reason for the lack of success at Mr. Milne's bird table is not only its wild and windswept location, but the fact that as one goes further north, the actual number of different kinds of birds and their density decreases. In the northwest of Scotland, there are no lesser spotted woodpeckers, nuthatches, marsh or willow tits. So we had to go back south to find the Flying Gourmet's Guide's top restaurant, where Miles Badley provides not only a clever design and an excellent menu, but first-rate service to attract a phenomenal number of birds. On the edge of some Herefordshire woodland, Miles Badley's feeding spectacular is not a single bird table, but a complete wooden platform built for mass catering. Every day, he provides food by the barrow load. He spends £1,000 a year serving 100 weight of wheat a week, 300 weight of peanuts a winter, and pounds of suet, which he dispenses from his patent serve-yourself factory. When he's ready to welcome the diners, the 6 tables are buried in food, and as soon as Miles goes back into his kitchen, the woodland's empty. Over 800 individual birds at once on the feeding platform, turning it black with birds. And these aren't your sparrows, like on most bird tables, because sparrows are a rarity in this garden. These are finches, mostly tourists from Scandinavia that boost our local populations in winter. Greenfinches. A yellowhammer, an uncommon bird table client, and beautiful bramblings. And it's not just the phenomenal numbers which are amazing at the Miles hypertable, but also the variety of species. One visitor even surprises the birds. This female kestrel comes daily for fresh meat. But it's not only the hen, her mate arrives too, easily distinguished by his slaty grey head and tail. Service here is round the clock, with birds feeding from dawn until dusk. Even at night, services continue, and Miles lights up his restaurant and waits with his tame tawny owl for the first of the night shift. Frustrated, the injured captive calls at the wild intruder, who totally ignores him. Taking his share of the kestrel's meal, the owl disappears into the night, leaving Miles waiting to serve the last customers. The owl drops off, but eventually, at 4 in the morning, shapes appear from out of the woods. Fallow deer. These deer have learned to exploit the grain left out for the finches. Yes, spoiled old Miles has a whole herd. Just some of the star guests at the Flying Gourmet's Guide's top restaurant.